Lila Gregson stood in the doorway of her attic, staring at a cardboard box she hadn't seen in years. The edges were frayed, and the tape had long since lost its stickiness. Scribbled on the top in bold black marker were the words, "Old Photos 2010. Her husband, Victor, called up the stairs. "Do you need help up there?" "No, I'm fine," she called back, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Victor had always joked about her hoarding tendencies, teasing her for holding on to things she claimed had sentimental value. But this box wasn't just sentimental. It was a Pandora's box of memories Lila had deliberately buried. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the lid. For years, she'd avoided opening it, convincing herself that the past was best left behind. But today, the urge to confront what lay inside was too strong to resist. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. The box was filled with photographs, postcards, and old letters. On top was a photo that immediately made Lila's breath catch. It was of her and Daniel, not her husband, Victor, but Daniel, the man she'd been with before him. She hadn't thought about Daniel in years, not since their relationship had ended in heartbreak. But as her fingers traced the edges of the photo, the memories came flooding back. His laugh, the way he'd held her hand, the promises they'd made and broken. Beneath the photo was an envelope, its edges yellowed with age. It was addressed to her, written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Why didn't I throw this away? She thought, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Lila, I know things ended badly between us, but there's something you need to know. Please call me. It's important." Daniel, ***, Lila's heart pounded as she stared at the letter. She remembered receiving it all those years ago and shoving it into the box without a second thought. She hadn't wanted to hear what Daniel had to say back then. But now, with years of distance between them, her curiosity burned. What had Daniel wanted to tell her? She glanced at the old phone number scrawled at the bottom of the letter. It was unlikely it still worked, but the urge to find out was irresistible. That night, after Victor had gone to bed, Lila sat at the kitchen table with her phone in hand. Her palms were clammy, her thumb hovering over the keypad. "This is crazy," she told herself. "It's been over a decade. Whatever it was, it doesn't matter anymore." But another part of her, the part that couldn't let go, pressed the buttons anyway. The line rang once, twice, and then a click. "Hello?" A man's voice, older but still familiar, came through the receiver. Lila's breath caught. "Daniel?" There was a pause, and then, "Lila? Is that you?" "It's me," she said softly. Daniel's laugh was low and incredulous. "I never thought I'd hear from you again." "I found your letter," Lila explained, her voice shaky. "The one you sent after we broke up." Another pause, longer this time. Then Daniel said, "I didn't think you'd ever read it." "I didn't," Lila admitted. "Not until today." "What was it you wanted to tell me?" Daniel sighed, his voice tinged with regret. "It's not something we can talk about over the phone. Can we meet? Please." Lila hesitated, her heart pounding. She thought of Victor upstairs, sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the storm brewing below. "Where?" she asked finally. Lila hadn't driven to the Oakwood Cafe in over a decade, but the place looked exactly as she remembered. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a soft glow over the parking lot. It was late, the cafe nearly empty save for a few night owls sipping coffee in the corner booths. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she sat in her car, staring at the entrance. This is a mistake, she thought. Whatever Daniel has to say can't be worth the risk. But the letter, Daniel's voice on the phone, and the unresolved questions gnawed at her. She took a deep breath, grabbed her purse, and stepped out of the car. The bell above the door jingled as she walked in, and she spotted him immediately. Daniel sat at a booth near the back, his head down as he stirred a cup of coffee. His hair was grayer now, his face lined with age, but there was no mistaking him. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening. "Lila," he said, standing quickly. "Hi, Daniel," she replied, her voice trembling. They stared at each other for a moment before Daniel gestured to the booth. "Sit, please." The silence between them was heavy as Lila slid into the seat across from him. She felt the weight of the years pressing down on her, the memories of a time when she had loved him so fiercely it had hurt. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Daniel said finally, his voice soft. "Neither was I," Lila admitted. "But I need to know, Daniel. What was so important that you sent that letter?" Daniel leaned back, his eyes scanning her face. "You look good," he said quietly. "Daniel," Lila said firmly, cutting through the tension. "Just tell me," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said. "But first, let me ask you something. Do you ever think about what happened between us? About why it ended the way it did?" Lila stiffened. "What are you talking about? You left me, Daniel. You disappeared without a word. I thought you didn't care." "That's not true," Daniel said quickly, his voice filled with emotion. "I cared, Lila. More than you know. But there were things happening back then, things I couldn't tell you." "Like what?" Lila demanded, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping to his coffee. "I found out something after we broke up," he said finally. "Something about your family." "My family?" Lila repeated, her confusion deepening. "What does my family have to do with this?" Daniel took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "It's about your father, Lila. He came to me after we broke up. He told me to stay away from you." Lila's heart stopped. "What?" Daniel nodded, his expression pained. "He said I wasn't good enough for you, that I'd ruin your life. And he offered me money to leave town." Lila stared at him, her mind racing. "You took it?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "I told him I didn't want his money. But he made it clear that if I didn't leave, he'd make my life, and yours, miserable. He threatened my job, my family. I didn't know what else to do." Lila's hands trembled as she processed his words. "So you left me because my father scared you?" Daniel shook his head. "I left because I thought it was the only way to protect you. I loved you too much to drag you into the mess he was creating." Lila felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. She had always believed that Daniel had walked away because he didn't care. But now, hearing this version of events, she didn't know what to think. "Why didn't you tell me back then?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Because I knew you wouldn't believe me," Daniel said softly. "And I thought you'd be better off without me." Lila leaned back in her seat, her mind spinning. "Why tell me now?" Daniel hesitated before speaking. "Because I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. And because there's something else you need to know." Lila's heart pounded as she leaned forward. "What is it?" Daniel looked her straight in the eye, his expression serious. "Your father didn't just threaten me, Lila. He had people watching you. He knew where you went, who you were with. He's the reason I left, but I think he's still keeping secrets from you. And I think those secrets might affect your life even now." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Lila's mind raced as she tried to piece together what Daniel was telling her. "What secrets?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know everything," Daniel admitted. "But I know your father was involved in some shady business deals back then. And I have a feeling those deals didn't end when he passed away." Lila stared at him, her chest tight. You think this still matters after all these years? I do, Daniel said. And I think you need to find out the truth before it's too late. Lila sat in her car outside the cafe for a long time after her meeting with Daniel. Her thoughts churned with disbelief, anger, and a gnawing curiosity she couldn't suppress. If what Daniel said was true, if her father had gone to such lengths to end their relationship, what else had he been hiding? She drove home in a daze, the familiar streets of her neighborhood blurring as her mind raced. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the house looked different to her, almost foreign, as if the revelations from the evening had tainted the life she had built there with Victor. Victor was still up, sitting in the living room with a book in his hands. He looked up when she walked in, his expression softening. "Hey," he said, smiling. "You're home late. Did you have fun catching up with Marcy?" Lila froze for a split second, her lie from earlier catching in her throat. She forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. "Yeah, it was nice," she said quickly. Victor nodded, returning to his book. "Good. You needed it." Lila headed upstairs, guilt gnawing at her as she avoided his gaze. Victor had always been kind and trusting, and lying to him felt like a betrayal. But she wasn't ready to tell him about Daniel yet, not until she knew more about the truth. The next morning, Lila found herself in the attic again, rummaging through the rest of the box. If her father had hidden so much from her, maybe there were more clues buried in the things she had inherited after his death. She found old photo albums, business cards, and documents she had never paid much attention to before. But one folder, tucked beneath a pile of outdated bank statements, caught her eye. It was labeled with her father's handwriting. Confidential, personal. Her hand shook as she opened it. Inside were contracts, handwritten notes, and photographs. The contracts were tied to real estate deals she didn't recognize, with signatures that weren't her father's but had been notarized under his name. The notes were cryptic, filled with references to meetings, payments, and names she didn't know. But it was the photographs that made her blood run cold. One of the photos showed her father sitting at a table with several men, all of them dressed sharply in suits. She didn't recognize most of them, but one face stood out: Gregory Shaw, a local businessman who had been involved in a high-profile embezzlement scandal years ago. Lila stared at the photo, her heart pounding. She remembered the scandal well, how Gregory had been accused of laundering money through shell companies and had disappeared before he could stand trial. Her father had never been linked to the case. At least, not publicly. Lila spent the rest of the day piecing through the documents, her unease growing with every page she read. The contracts were vague, but hinted at backdoor deals involving properties in the city's most valuable areas. One name kept appearing in the notes: R. Bellamy. The name was unfamiliar to Lila, but it seemed important. Her father had underlined it several times, and one of the contracts was even addressed to Bellamy directly. That evening, Lila sat across from Victor at dinner, her appetite gone as she pushed her food around her plate. "You've been quiet today," Victor said, his voice gentle. "Something on your mind?" Lila hesitated, her heart racing. She wanted to confide in him, to share what she had found. But how could she explain her meeting with Daniel without unraveling everything? "It's nothing," she said finally, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Victor frowned but didn't press her. Later that night, unable to sleep, Lila did something she hadn't done in years. She called her mother. Her mother lived in Florida now, enjoying a quiet retirement far removed from the chaos of the city. She picked up on the second ring. "Lila, this is a nice surprise," her mother said warmly. "Hi, Mom," Lila replied, her voice shaky. "Do you have a minute to talk?" "Of course. Is everything all right?" Lila hesitated. "It's about Dad." I found some things in the attic, documents, photos, and I have some questions. Her mother was silent for a moment. What kind of questions? Did Dad know Gregory Shaw? Lila asked, her voice trembling. Were they involved in anything illegal? Her mother let out a heavy sigh. Lila, why are you digging this up now? Because I need to know the truth, Lila said firmly. Did Dad have anything to do with Gregory Shaw's scandal? Her mother hesitated, and Lila could hear the tension in her voice when she finally spoke. Your father wasn't perfect, Lila. He made mistakes. But everything he did for the family. That's not an answer, Lila said, her frustration mounting. Did he or didn't he? Her mother sighed again. Yes, she admitted. Your father and Gregory were business partners for years. But when Gregory's scheme started falling apart, your father cut ties with him. He thought he could walk away clean, but Gregory wasn't the type to let people go easily. What does that mean? Lila asked, her voice shaking. It means your father was blackmailed, Lila, her mother said quietly. Gregory had leverage on him, things your father wanted to keep hidden. That's why he was so protective of you. He didn't want you to get caught up in it. Lila's mind reeled as her mother's words sank in. Her father had been involved in shady deals, blackmailed by a criminal, and had gone to extreme lengths to protect her from the fallout. But what exactly had Gregory known? And was it still affecting her life, even now? The weight of her mother's revelation left Lila sleepless. As the hours crept by, she sat in the living room, staring blankly at the folder of documents she had unearthed. Her father's connection to Gregory Shaw wasn't just a scandal of the past. It was something that had shaped her life in ways she was only now beginning to understand. By the time the sun rose, Lila's exhaustion had turned into determination. If her father had been blackmailed, there had to be evidence, proof of what Gregory had held over him. And if that proof still existed, it could explain why Daniel believed those secrets were still relevant today. That morning, Victor found her at the kitchen table, her laptop open and papers scattered around her. Lila, he said, frowning, did you sleep at all? She shook her head, not looking up. I couldn't. There's too much I need to figure out. Victor sat down across from her, his brow furrowed. Is this about your father? You've been acting strange ever since you started going through those old things. Lila hesitated, her stomach twisting with guilt. She hadn't told Victor about her meeting with Daniel or the things she had discovered since then. But the secrets were becoming too heavy to bear alone. I found something, she admitted, her voice low. Something about my dad and his business dealings. He was involved with Gregory Shaw. Victor's eyes widened. Gregory Shaw? The guy who disappeared after that embezzlement scandal? Lila nodded, her throat tight. Apparently, Gregory blackmailed my dad. I don't know the details yet, but I think it's connected to something bigger. Something that might still affect us. Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Why would it still matter after all this time? I don't know, Lila said, her voice trembling. But Daniel, my ex, he thinks there's more to the story. He thinks whatever my dad was hiding might still be out there. Victor stiffened at the mention of Daniel. Wait, you talked to Daniel about this? Lila hesitated, realizing too late that she had said more than she intended. Yes, she admitted softly. I met with him because he had information about my dad. He's the one who told me about the threats. Victor's jaw tightened, and his voice dropped. You went behind my back to meet with your ex? Lila, what the hell were you thinking? The tension in the room was palpable as Lila met Victor's gaze. I didn't mean to hide it from you, she said. Would you ever forgive someone if they cheated once, but swore it would never happen again? Write in the comments. I just... I needed answers, and I didn't know how to explain it to you. Victor stood, pacing the room. So you decided to leave me in the dark? To deal with this on your own while dragging him back into your life? It's not like that, Lila said quickly. I didn't go looking for Daniel. This is about my dad, not him. Victor turned to face her, his expression hard. Maybe it started with your dad, but now it's about more than that. You're keeping secrets, Lila. How am I supposed to trust you when you're hiding things from me? Lila's chest tightened, her guilt overwhelming her. I'm sorry, she whispered. I should have told you. But I need to figure this out, Victor. I need to know the truth. Victor sat back down, his shoulders slumping. Fine, he said quietly. But from now on, no more secrets. We handle this together. Lila nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. Okay, together. The next step in their search for answers was clear. They needed to figure out who Bellamy was. The name appeared in almost every document Lila had found, but there was no indication of what role this person had played in her father's dealings. Victor suggested starting with public records. Together, they combed through property listings, business registries, and old news articles, searching for any mention of Bellamy. It wasn't until Victor stumbled upon an archived legal document that they finally found a lead. Here, he said, pointing to the screen. Bellamy Real Estate Group. They were involved in a lawsuit with Shaw Enterprises back in 2008. Lila leaned over, her heart pounding as she read the document. The lawsuit had been over a disputed property deal, with allegations of fraud and misrepresentation on both sides. It says here that Bellamy Real Estate was dissolved after the case was settled, Victor continued. But the founder, Robert Bellamy, is still listed as the defendant in the case. Robert Bellamy, Lila repeated, the name sending a chill down her spine. She grabbed her phone and searched for more information. It didn't take long to find an obituary. Robert Bellamy had died 3 years ago. But his son, Richard Bellamy, had taken over what remained of the business. Later that day, Lila made the call. The number she found for Richard Bellamy led to a small office downtown, where he now ran a property management company. Mr. Bellamy? She asked when he answered. Yes, speaking, came the gruff reply. My name is Lila Gregson. I'm the daughter of Edward Sampson. I believe our fathers may have worked together years ago. There was a long pause before Bellamy responded. Edward Sampson, he said slowly. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. I'm trying to understand some things about my dad's past, Lila said carefully. I was hoping you might be able to help. Another pause. Then, come by my office tomorrow. I think we need to talk. Lila sat in the waiting room of Richard Bellamy's office, her heart pounding. The modest space was a far cry from the opulence her father had surrounded himself with during his business years. A small potted plant sat wilting on the corner of a scuffed desk, and the faint hum of a ceiling fan filled the silence. She clutched the folder of documents tightly in her lap, feeling the weight of the secrets they might unlock. Victor had offered to come with her, but she had declined, sensing that this was something she needed to face alone. Miss Gregson? A voice called, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Richard Bellamy standing in the doorway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his silver hair and stern expression giving him an air of authority. Come on in, he said, stepping aside to let her pass. Bellamy's office was equally unremarkable, with a cluttered desk and walls adorned with faded certificates. He gestured for her to sit, then lowered himself into the chair opposite her. So, he began, folding his hands on the desk. You're Edward Sampson's daughter. Lila nodded, her throat dry. That's right. Bellamy studied her for a moment before speaking. Your father and mine were partners for years. But I'm guessing you already know that. I know they work together, Lila said carefully, but I don't know much more than that. My father wasn't exactly forthcoming about his business dealings. Bellamy let out a humorless laugh. That sounds about right. Edward was a smart man, but he was also a man who knew how to keep secrets. What kind of secrets? Lila asked, her voice trembling. Bellamy's expression darkened. The kind that could ruin lives. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a faded file folder, placing it in front of her. This is everything I've kept about the deals our fathers made, and the ones that went south. Lila opened the folder, her stomach churning as she scanned the contents. There were contracts, invoices, and correspondence, much like the documents she had found in her attic. But there was one piece of paper that caught her eye, a ledger detailing payments made to various shell companies. What is this? She asked, holding it up. That, Bellamy said grimly, is the key to everything. Your father and mine were funneling money through fake businesses to cover their tracks. Gregory Shaw was involved too. He was the mastermind behind it all. Lila's heart sank. But why? What were they trying to hide? Bellamy leaned forward, his voice low. Fraud. Embezzlement. Bribes. They were buying influence, covering up shady deals, and pocketing millions in the process. When Shaw's empire started to crumble, your father tried to back out. But by then, it was too late. Lila's hand shook as she sifted through the documents. Her father had always presented himself as a man of integrity, a pillar of the community. But the truth painted a very different picture. There's more, Bellamy said, his tone grave. Gregory Shaw didn't just disappear. He was murdered. Lila froze, her breath catching in her throat. Murdered? By who? Bellamy hesitated, his gaze steady. No one knows for sure. But there were rumors that your father had him killed to protect himself and his family. Lila felt like the ground had fallen out from under her. That can't be true, she whispered. My father wasn't a killer. I'm not saying he pulled the trigger, Bellamy said, but he had connections. People who would have done it for him. Lila closed the folder, her mind racing. Why are you telling me this now? Because it's not over, Bellamy said firmly. There are still people out there who know what happened. People who could come after you if they think you have something they want. Lila's chest tightened. Like what? Bellamy gestured to the documents in front of her. Those papers. They're evidence of everything. Proof of the fraud, the money laundering, the bribes. If the wrong people find out you have them, you and your family could be in danger. Lila left Bellamy's office in a daze, clutching the folder tightly as she made her way to her car. Her mind swirled with questions. Had her father truly been involved in Gregory Shaw's murder? And if so, how far had he gone to protect his secrets? When she arrived home, Victor was waiting for her, his expression tense. Well, he asked, what did you find out? Lila hesitated, her stomach churning. It's worse than I thought, she admitted. My dad wasn't just involved with Gregory Shaw. He might have been responsible for his death. Victor's eyes widened in shock. What? And there's more, Lila continued, her voice shaking. The documents I found, they're evidence of everything. If someone finds out we have them. She couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Victor stepped closer, his expression softening. We'll figure this out, Lila. Together. Lila nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. But deep down, she knew that the truth about her father had irrevocably changed her life, and there was no going back.